Third edition was a huge step forward for the Dungeons & Dragons brand, but ultimately it was plagued with problems. Spells were used in combinations not conceived of by the developers, some of the classes were underwhelming at best, and the rules were in places poorly worded and heavily open to interpretation. The age of the internet provided an opportunity for immediate feedback. Taking this feedback into consideration, Wizards of the Coast took it upon themselves to update their 3rd edition rules. This updated version was released in July of 2003 and is known as D&D 3.5. For many of us, news of the impending 3.5 revision came in the February 2003 edition of Dragon Magazine, number 304, with the front cover displaying a header which read, "Is 3rd edition dead?" Now the headline definitely grab people's attention, which I think was what it was intended to do. The fact that they were confirming that a new version of the game was going to be coming out, I don't think was as shocking as perhaps they thought it was going to be. For a lot of people, they kind of looked at things like in the previous year, D20 Modern came out, which featured some rules changes that people thought would end up being ported over into D&D. And also in 2002, Wizards of the Coast did a revised version of the Star Wars D20 role-playing game, which again a lot of people speculated was testing the waters for a revision to the Dungeons & Dragons brand. Now inside, the article just discusses the reasons that they decided to make the change. Of course, there's the big 3.5 revision update, which was also featured in several other issues of Dragon Magazine up until the actual release of the core books. So the idea behind this was, the articles would discuss some of the design philosophy that went into the revisions when it comes to things like rule mechanics, spells, classes, monsters, things of that nature. They were designed basically to get everybody's interest and kind of hype everybody up for the release of 3.5, but I don't think it necessarily had that effect, unfortunately. I remember, at least at my local gaming store, most of us would spend our time every Friday from the time it was announced to the time that it came out discussing how we just weren't interested in 3.5. A lot of us felt that there wasn't a need to completely revamp the entire 3 core rulebooks that they had decided to go ahead and do. It felt to some of us like it was just an attempt to do a cash grab, force players to have to buy the latest version of the books, completely invalidating purchases that they previously made. And the prices were going to be around $50 per book, so you're spending $150 to keep playing the latest version of the game that you already had. So we spent a lot of time just kind of talking about how we weren't interested in getting 3.5, how we're going to boycott it, and all those things. And I'd like to say that I held firm in my decision to do that, at least until the owner of the store ended up unpacking the first order, and I got to look through the player's handbook for the first time. Once I did that, I decided I was going to pick up a copy, and the justification that I used was that what I was going to do is just go through and read the stuff that I liked, house rule it into my existing 3.0 game, and that'd be fine. It would make sense to purchase the book for that reason. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was, as I read it, I thought if just basically finally found out that it would be easier to house rule out the things I didn't like than to house rule in the things that I did. So with that in mind, a couple weeks later I ended up ordering the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. So that little bit of background out of the way, let's go through and have a brief look at some of the more noticeable and noteworthy changes. Races remained relatively unchanged in the revision from 3.0 to 3.5. However, a new ability was added to the dwarf, half-orc, and the gnome. This ability was called Weapon Familiarity, and what it did was it took some of the weapons that are in the game that have a racial name attached to them, like the Dwarven War Axe, the orc double axe, and the gnomish hookhammer, and basically says that if any weapon bears the same name as the race, then that race would be considered proficient with it as if it was a martial weapon. So they treated it as martial instead of an exotic, like they all were. Now that being said, it didn't automatically give them proficiency with the weapon. So just being a gnome doesn't automatically mean you can use a gnome hookhammer. You would have to have martial weapon proficiency in order to use it. But if you did, you could use the weapon without having to spend a feat, which is what you had to do for pretty much every exotic weapon. So Dwarf Fighter no longer had to spend one of their feats in order to use a Dwarven War Axe. Another change that was made, which is somewhat unusual, I guess we could say, is that the gnome had their favorite class changed from illusionist, which is what they had been since going way back into even like first edition, second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and 3.0 had them as illusionists. In 3.5, their favorite class was changed to, of all things, it was changed to Bard. Not quite sure 100% why they made that decision. Part of it, from my understanding, is that when they were designing 3.5, they didn't want any of the races to have a subclass of another class as their favorite class. So knowing that illusionist is a specialist wizard, which meant that if you chose that, you were limited in some options, they decided to make the change and go with Bard, which is a little unusual, I guess, but I'm sure it makes sense to them. Now, as far as that's pretty much it for the other races, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail in terms of all the changes made to the classes. It would just end up being way too long a video. So what I'm going to do is just kind of do a brief talk about most of them. I'm only really going to focus on one class, the class that got the most change. But we'll start off with the Barbarian. Basically, their most major noteworthy changes are the fact that their damage reduction values have changed. So they get damage reduction starting at an earlier level, and it goes up to a maximum of damage reduction 5 instead of, I believe it was damage reduction 3 in 3.0. So they get it a little bit sooner. They get a number that's a little bit more worthy of having the ability. So as far as that goes, that got quite a bit better. They also gained a higher level of Rage, which was called Mighty Rage, which gives, instead of the +4 bonus that your normal Rage gives you, or the +6 bonus that Greater Rage gave you, this gives you, the Barbarian, a +8 bonus to Strength and Constitution. So like +4 to hit, +4 hit points per level. So they went ahead and gave them that higher level of Rage, which they get at 20th level. As far as the Bard goes, the Bard's music abilities were spread out. Instead of being able to use any of them at any level, as long as they had the requisite number of ranks, they had to achieve a certain level before they were able to use a particular version of bardic music. Now, they still needed to have the ranks in Perform, but they, would end up having to be a certain level as well. So they spread that out so they weren't getting kind of everything more or less right up front. And they also added 2 new abilities, which were Song of Freedom and Inspire Greatness. So they added a couple of new abilities to the Bard as far as their bardic music is concerned. Now the Cleric remained relatively unchanged, actually. The biggest change for the Cleric in the newer revision was some changes that were made to several of their spells, which I'll touch on a little bit later on in this video. I'm not going to focus on it right now. Now the same is pretty much true for the Druid, the Sorcerer, and the Wizard. They were also more or less left unchanged, aside from the spells, because they're primarily spellcasting class. So I'm not going to really discuss them at this point. I'm going to kind of skip over them, and I'll talk a little bit about spells later on. So we'll skip past the Druid there. Now the Fighter, again, Fighter remained pretty much the same, but they did add new feats to the Fighter that they were able to use. So They were things like greater versions of, or improved versions of, weapon focus and weapon specialization, as well as a feat called weapon mastery, which a fighter could only take for one single weapon. So they added some new feats, but other than that, they pretty much stayed the same as well. Now for the monk's unarmed attacks were changed. So instead of having a separate progression for unarmed strikes and regular base attack, they were given an ability called Flurry of Blows in its place, which in the beginning imposed a -2 penalty to attack, but it gave you an extra attack. It's kind of like what Rapid Shot always was for 3rd edition or 3.5. That one remained pretty much the same as well. Now, as they go through levels, their base attack and their Flurry of Blows bonus ends up leveling out to the point where they're the same, which happens at, I think, around 6th or 7th level is when that occurs. Or, yeah, I think it was around 7th level, when 7th or 8th level when that occurs. But anyway, so they do eventually get to have the same attack bonus for each of their attacks, and they get multiple attacks, and the weapon damage, or their unarmed damage, was also changed. In 3.0, they ended up getting the ability to roll a d20 for damage starting at 16th level. In 3.5, they scaled that back a bit, and they had them deal 2d8 up until 20th level, when the unarmed strike damage goes up to 2d10. So they kind of scaled back how much damage that they did, but they gave them quite a few attacks, and again, at 20th level they get to roll 2d10, so that's not too bad. The Paladin curiously received little from the revision. The only major changes that they did gain a few extra uses of their Smite Evil ability. In 3.0, I think it was just once per day, but in 3.5 they get up to 5 times per day at 20th level. They also did space out some of their abilities, so that they don't gain everything by 1st or 2nd level, which is what they did in 3.0. So you actually had to go through quite a few levels in order to get a lot of your Paladin abilities. Curiously, they actually ended up making their Remove Disease ability worse. And Remove Disease is an ability that I never really liked, because it allows you to cast one casting of the spell once per week when you first get it. So, it's 7 days you have to go before you can cast it again, and it only affects a single target. In 3.0, the Paladin, managed to get up to 6 uses of that per week. So it's not as awful, although it's still pretty awful. But in 3.5, they actually lose one of those abilities, so they only get up to 5 times per week. So I guess they can cure disease Monday through Friday, and they take the weekend off. Now, Remove Disease is something that I kind of house ruled out, and just put it on their spell list, and let them be able to use it as a spell, which they could do on a daily basis instead of on a weekly basis. And where they would have gained Remove Disease, one of the house rules that I made is that I drew up a short list of feats that they could choose, like sort of a bonus feat that related to their their Paladin abilities type of thing. So that's basically what they ended up getting out of that. Now the Ranger, hands down, saw the most as far as changes go from any other class in 3.5. To start off with, their hit dice were changed from a D8, or sorry, from a D10 down to a D8. So they got fewer hit points, which at first really bothered me. It was a few years later when I realized that in first edition AD&D, they actually had D8s for their hit dice. So eventually that became okay with me. They also got rid of their proficiency with medium armor, which they had in 3.0, which is an ability that never really made sense, because in 3.0 they would lose their ranger abilities, specifically their 2-weapon fighting, which was one of the main reasons to take the class. They would lose that if they wore medium armor, even though they were proficient in medium armor by default, just by being the class. So that's something that never really made any sense to me. So thankfully they just got rid of that altogether. Now another thing that got vastly improved with the Ranger was their favorite enemy ability. So in 3.0, just to kind of explain, they gained their first favorite enemy, and with that favorite enemy, amongst some, the bonus they get to, like some of the skills to track it or know things about it, a Ranger would receive a +1 bonus to damage against their favorite enemy type. Now, at I think around 5th level, they gained their second favorite enemy. So the Ranger would then choose a second enemy that they would have a bonus against, and they would receive a +1 bonus against that second enemy. And their first favorite enemy would now have a +2 bonus to damage on. And this would go on until they got their 5th favorite enemy, which gave them +1 against that enemy that they chose at high levels, and they would get up to +5 with the first favorite enemy that they chose. The problem with that is it kind of forced a lot of metagaming or a lot of long-term planning when playing a Ranger. So instead of taking something that would make sense for them to fight at, first, second, third, fourth level, like goblinoids, orcs, gnolls, things along those lines, a lot of times players would end up choosing something that they expected to fight much later on. So they would take like dragons or evil outsiders, or just things that they would end up suspecting that they would face at, the high end levels, in order to get the most out of that bonus. I mean, if you've got to get, a bonus to damage, if you want to fight dragons, for example, because you're going to fight dragons at higher levels, only having a +1 bonus on damage against dragons is kind of unimpressive, underwhelming, and it would just, that's just not the way that people ended up playing the class. So they ended up changing that completely. Now, the way they did it in 3.5, which I thought was immensely better, is they would choose their first favorite enemy, and they would get a +2 bonus to damage against them, as well as +2 on certain skill checks to, track them, know things about them, things along those lines. So they would get +2, which is already a worthwhile bonus. And then when they gain their second favorite enemy, they would choose a new enemy type off the list, and they would receive by default a +2 bonus on damage against that. Now, when they did that, they would also receive another +2 bonus that was floating. So they could put it on either their original favorite enemy or the new one that they just chose. So what it basically meant was that you could choose something at first level that you're actually going to fight at first level, get the most out of that ability, and then when you start moving on into the higher levels, you can choose something that you're going up against, at that point in time, and you can get, a +4 bonus against them. So a lot of times it led to, getting +2 against your first favorite enemy, and then +4 against your, second, third, fourth, and fifth favorite enemy, which just all around made it a much better version of the favorite enemy ability. So as far as that goes, they really did make a great change for that, and they definitely improved the Ranger overall from what it was in 3.0. Now, one last major noteworthy thing that they did is in 3.0, the Ranger, and going back through the earlier editions, the Ranger automatically got 2-weapon fighting as an ability. That was just automatically, something that you get for being a Ranger. In 3.5, they actually give you the option to choose between 2-weapon fighting or archery. So if you take 2-weapon fighting, you still get the regular ability to fight with 2 weapons, and you get, as it improves as you level up, you get abilities that allow you to make extra attacks. So at one point you get up to, I think, 3 attacks with your offhand weapon, as well as, 4 attacks with your primary. So, they got that ability, but if you chose archery, you would end up getting rapid shot, so it'll, similarly to the 2-weapon fighting, it allows you to make an extra attack. And then they would also be able to use, they would gain feats like many shot, which allows you to fire arrows against multiple opponents in a certain area. It's based on your level, how many different arrows you can fire, and then at your highest level of it, you would get improved precise shot, which I believe completely ignored cover concealment unless it was absolute, like complete and total cover. So they ended up fixing that in the way that, if you wanted to play a Ranger because you like to be an archer, this was definitely a good way to go about it. Moving on to the Rogue. The Rogue was only lightly modified from 3.5. So they remained pretty much the same as well. One thing that did end up changing for the Rogue was their Uncanny Dodge ability had sort of changed. Uncanny Dodge was changed from what it was in 3.0, and they had a new ability called Trap Sense that they received, which they start getting at a lower level. And what that does is it gives you a bonus on your reflex saves against traps, similar to what Sense Trap did in 3.0. Or I can't remember if that's the exact wording of it now, but it was the same kind of thing, but you get more progressive bonuses with it. So at 19th level, it reaches its maximum of +6 on reflex saves against traps, which is pretty good considering that they also had evasion, which allows them to take no damage on a successful save. And I think one of the special abilities that they're able to choose allowed them to actually gain improved evasion, greater evasion, which basically they would take half damage on a failed save and nothing on a full save. So the rogues got kind of modified as far as that goes. Now again, as far as the sorcerer and the wizard goes, most of their changes came in the form of their spells. The only thing that sort of changed with them as far as the class itself goes was the familiar abilities were changed. In 3.0, the familiars were able to grant sometimes bonuses on ability scores. So this got removed, and in exchange, like I think it was the Toad, gave you +2 to con, if I recall correctly. So the Toad now gives them its master +3 hit points. So they just made a few changes along those lines, but for the most part, it was all about the spells, which I'll touch on later on. So now let's just move on right on to skills. Several skills were changed in 3.5. Alchemy, for example, which was in 3.0, was integrated into the craft skill. And skills like Intuit, Direction, and Wilderness Lore were combined into Survival in 3.5. So they did combine some skills to make them much better. But oddly enough, there were certain skills that really needed to be combined that never were in 3.5 at all. What I'm talking about mainly are things like Spot and Listen and Hide and Move Silently. They were skills that were always taken together. You pretty much always made checks with them together at the same time. And it just ended up really kind of watering down how many skills you could take because you always felt obligated to have both of them. It would have been really nice to have seen them group them together in 3.5 to create Stealth and Perception. Unfortunately, that just didn't happen. That's something that, as far as I'm concerned, is a huge missed opportunity in 3.5, and it's something that I later on ended up house ruling into my games, and I made them both one skill. So that's pretty much it for skills. They remain more or less the same. Feats. Not going to touch on them too much, but there were some new feats added. Like I said, the ones with the fighters were added. There were some more class-specific ones that were kind of put in there as well. Like Natural Spell, I think, was one that was added for druids to be able to cast spells while wild-shaped. So there was just some new feats added, which were basically taken from some of the previous supplements that came out. As far as weapons go, weapons is something else that did receive something of a big change as well. So now the weapons had sizes, and you would have to choose the weapon size that was appropriate for your character size. So instead of having, for example, you would see the damage for small and damage for medium weapons. So if you were a halfling, for example, you couldn't use a basic short sword like it was a longsword for you, or use a longsword like it was a two-handed sword. You would have to buy the weapon that was appropriate for your size, so it still had the same cost, regardless of whether it was made for a large or a small character. So just using an example, longsword does a d6 if you're small, a short sword does a d4 if you're small, and a dagger got reduced down to a d3 from a d4. And the same went for larger characters as well. So they would actually increase the damage if you were a larger creature trying to use the weapon. So like a longsword would do 2d6. It's basically the same idea. as just using a different weapon of a size that's not appropriate for you, and using it as like the next category up, like said, a halfling using a short sword like a long sword, or using a longsword like a greatsword. So that's just a change that they made, which made things a little bit difficult, because when it came to finding magic weapons, for example, you had to be careful, armor, weapons, equipment like that, you had to be careful what size you ended up making it, or house ruling in that, it automatically resizes to fit the wearer. So that's more or less it for the equipment. That's the only thing I really want to touch on there. As far as combat goes, combat remains relatively the same as it always was. One of the things that they did try to do was make attacks of opportunity seem a little less overwhelming, a little less, like a gray area. And in 3.0, it just wasn't really described super well. The chart was littered, like absolutely littered with entries that said, does it provoke an attack of opportunity? Instead of yes or no, it said maybe. Now, there are a few maybes here in this chart, but each one of them has a number annotation with it. And it actually, at the bottom of the chart, gives you exactly what prevents the attack of opportunity from occurring. So instead of being something where you have to look more further into the rules, it's all there in the chart, and it makes a lot more sense. So they did improve that. It still ended up being kind of a big pain in the butt overall, but it's something that at least they tried to make it a little bit more user friendly. Alright, so now that we've gone through all that, I want to skip over and just talk about a few of the spells. Now, there's just way too many spells to talk about, changes, to discuss, that I just can't touch on all of them, so I'm only going to talk about a very select few, and they're going to be examples of spells that were changed for the better, and some spells that ended up being changed unnecessarily, and, definitely for the worse. So one of the first spells I want to talk about was one that actually ended a campaign for me when I was running my last 3.0 campaign before I started the one that I eventually transferred over to 3.5. And that spell is Creeping Doom. So in 3.0, you could summon this spell, Creeping Doom. It had a range that you could cast it at, so it didn't have to be centered around you, and you could basically just drop it on a group of enemies. And what it did is it summoned 1,000 small insects that bit or stung or anything along those lines, and each one of those 1,000 bugs would deal 1 point of damage to an enemy in their space, or a creature in their space. The issue with that is that you're dropping basically 1,000 points of damage right there on the battlefield, and even though the insect dies after it deals a point of damage, you still have a pool of 1,000 points of damage that you can use until it's gone. And since I don't like to overdo monsters in my campaigns, I like to have a lot of more humanoid enemies. It was an absolute disaster. It basically ended an encounter that I'd spent 2 or 3 hours kind of working on, designing the NPCs, writing up their tactics and everything else. So just completely obliterated that combat. I even had a spell called Fortunate Fate cast on the leader of the group, and what that was, it was a 3.0 spell, which was in I want to say it was in Magic of Faerun, and once you reach 0 hit points, it would automatically cast the heal spell on you. So it would heal you back up to full. I did this to kind of make him, that much more tough, but in the end, it just ended up, the Creeping Doom was dropped on him. He didn't have more than 1,000 points of damage, or hit points, so, he ended up dying. The spell kicked in, he got healed back up to full, and then just immediately died again, so he never got to do anything. That spell, in my opinion, was absolutely awful, and it's one that made me want to stop running 3.0. In 3.5, they did change it so that what it does, instead of having like 1,000 points of damage, it just drops on you. It summons some centipede swarms, and so the swarms still deal damage, and they're still not something to be taken lightly. But you're not going to immediately kill whatever it was centered on. Other spells that were changed, in my opinion, for the better: Heal and Harm. in my opinion, received a better revision when they were done. And what they ended up getting was like harm in 3.0 reduce you from whatever hit point total you had, including max, all the way down to only having 1d4 hit points left, so between 1 and 4. And then heal would end up healing you all the way up to full hit points, regardless of how many you had. They were really powerful spells, especially harm, because if you fail your save, then a kobold with a dagger can take you down, type of thing. So what they decided to do was they made the two spells work similarly, and just be opposite of each other. So instead of just healing up to full, heal now restored 10 hit points per level of the spellcaster casting it, up to a maximum of 150. So at 15th level, they could heal 150 points of damage, which is quite a bit. In most cases, it would take you up to full. And harm would deal 10 points of damage, up to 150, with the caveat being that it couldn't reduce you below 1 hit point. So they made those a lot better. Haste was also changed to be more like the opposite of slow. So the slow spell reduced you to partial actions, and I'll talk about that in a moment, which meant that you could either move or attack, but you couldn't do both at the same time. You also took a -1, I think, on your armor class and your reflex save. So what haste used to do in 3.0 was it gave you an extra standard action that you could take, or an extra action that you could take, so you can get like another full round of attacks in. Spellcasters could cast 2 spells per round, which at higher levels gets incredibly powerful. And it just ended up being really just hard to deal with, especially at those high levels. So in 3.5, they fixed it so that, it worked, like I said, the opposite of slow. So it gave you a +1 bonus to your armor class and reflex saves. And if you took a full attack action, it would grant you just 1 extra attack to sort of try to even it out some. So it wasn't giving you 2 full attack actions, and spellcasters could not use it to cast another spell per round. Now the change that they also made with that is that haste used to only affect 1 target, and now it affected multiple targets. So you could cast haste once and have it affect all your fighters. It could have everybody in your group could be affected by it, which is great. Now, as far as a spell that was definitely changed for the worse, and something that I never really understood why they needed to change, were the stat boosting spells like Bull Strength. So in 3.5, they added a stat boosting spell for every single ability score, which I don't think the Player's Handbook in 3.0 had. I want to say it had Bull Strength and maybe Bear's Endurance, and maybe one for Wisdom, if I recall correctly. But in 3.5, they all got one, which, hey, that's definitely a step for, towards a better spell. In 3.0, we'll just use Bull Strength here because they all work the same. Bull Strength added 1d4 + 1 to the target strength, so anywhere from 2 to 5. So you're at least getting a +1 bonus on any of your strength abilities. And it lasted for 1 hour per level, which made it a great buff spell. That was a low-level spell that could be cast at the beginning of a day and would be useful for pretty much every combat that you had, especially as you got up in levels. So it was a great spell as far as that went, and it made it so that the spellcasters wouldn't be spending the first several rounds of combat casting buff spells solely on the other characters before they get to do anything fun themselves. So I always thought that was a great spell. In 3.5, they made it, instead of being a random amount, they had just be a static +4 bonus, which again, it's not bad. It's consistent. But the downside is that they slash the duration all the way from 1 hour per level going down to only 1 minute per level. So it became more or less useless. It was great for 1 combat, and that was it. More or less, because you only got a maximum of 20 minutes out of it, instead of getting a full day's worth basically from it. This led to some situations where the spellcasters didn't like having those spells anymore because, again, it took up their first few rounds of pretty much every combat. Also, in my experience, the shorter durations of these buff spells made the players eventually become more and more reckless as they tried to get the most out of those spells. I recall there were several situations in which the players in my campaigns would end up running from one room of the dungeon to another just to try to get as many fights in as they could before the spells wore off. Which is definitely not the best way to do things, but they wanted to do it because, again, they didn't want to waste that spell. They didn't want to have the spellcasters have to cast it on them again. So that happened more times than it probably should have. But again, I understand the reason why, just because of how limited those spells had become. And that's just an example of spells that really didn't need to be changed. There was really no call from the players saying that these spells are overpowered and broken. They were ones that were just all around useful and great utilitarian spells that you would cast alongside things like mage armor and other spells that you would do at the beginning of the day. So I'm not quite sure why they decided to change that, and there's probably more examples than that of spells that were changed that really didn't need to be. And if something that might be of interest to you guys in the future, certainly let me know, and I can do a more in-depth video on some of the spells that were changed. At this point in time, for the sake of trying not to make this video too long, I'm kind of gonna leave it there with the spells. So there's a few ones that were changed for the better, and some spells that were definitely changed for the worst. So again, let me know if you want to hear more about that in another video, but for now, let's move on to the other core books. One of the goals with 3.5 was to have all three of the core books have the same or very close number of pages within them. The Player's Handbook maintained more or less the same amount of pages that it had previously. It may have added a few more, but the DMG and the Monster Manual were both significantly thinner than the 3.0 version of the Player's Handbook. So in order to have the Dungeon Master's Guide at this point in time, the one we're talking about, have page count similar to that of the Player's Handbook, they've added quite a few things to it. Some more magic items were added, but in addition to that, under the campaign building chapter, they actually included some information that you would have found in the 3.0 Manual of the Planes. It's not quite as comprehensive as the actual full release itself. Unfortunately, that's a book that I don't have, but I'm happy to have the information that's in here. So it goes over the basics, like the elemental planes, the positive and negative energy planes, Limbo, Pandemonium, the Grey Waste of Hades, Carcery, the Abyss, and the Nine Hells, Archeron. So it goes over quite a few of the different planes that you can set adventures in, and it contains a decent amount of information to allow you to create campaigns or adventures that take place within there. In addition to that, it also expanded greatly on the number of prestige classes that were in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So the original DMG for 3.0 only had about 6 prestige classes in them. And in 3.5, they actually increase that number up to 16 total prestige classes in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, a lot of these were actually pretty good. Some of the few prestige classes that I was okay with players using were actually in this book. So, the ones that were here, generally speaking, the better designed ones and the ones that are more likely to see use because they clearly, or more clearly, have the ability to fit in easily into any campaign. So it's nice to see that that information expanded upon. So while the page count was increased overall, there was one section of the DMG which sadly ended up getting diminished versus what it was like in 3.0, and that would be the section here on NPC statistics. So in the 3.0 DMG, these charts were absolutely phenomenal for creating an NPC essentially on the fly. So if the player characters did something unexpected and you needed to have them face some sort of enemy quickly, and it wasn't something that would fall within the monster manual, so say they were in town and did something that they probably shouldn't have, and raise the guards against them, you could use the charts that were in here to basically create them right there on the spot. It had everything from what skills they had to what feats they had selected, spells that were selected from all the way from 1st to 20th level. So it was absolutely fantastic. Now, the 3.5 version, unfortunately, didn't really include as much information. So it gives some basic stuff, but the part that's kind of disappointing is that the skill points and the number of feats were all, instead of being predetermined, at the time that the book was published, it just gives you the number of the skills and feats that you can select. And that's kind of problematic because now you're having to do work, right? You're having to allocate things which can, in the situation of needing something right away and something in a hurry, having to kind of put in and fill in some of these skills or select feats kind of would grind the game to a bit of a halt. So it really diminished the usefulness of these charts. Unfortunately, it would have been great if they would have kept that. Instead, they gave a few sample NPCs, but it really wasn't as great as it could have been. If they would have just stuck to what they had. I mean, if you're expanding the number of pages, why take one of the most useful sections of your book and actually, take away from it? It just, unfortunately, that was kind of a bad decision as far as that goes. Other than that, there's not really a lot of major issues to speak about with the DMG. It's pretty much the same as it was before, just with a few other things added in. One of the other actually things I should mention that they did include in here with the characters was the ability to go into epic levels. So epic levels were something that were introduced in 3.0. There was an epic level handbook, which maybe one day I'll talk about because it's not really my favorite supplement of all time. But with the 3.5 DMG, it actually goes into a little bit of detail on how to make epic level characters. It gives you some feats you can select. And thankfully it does stay away from trying to create epic level spells, which always was a bit of a hassle. So the epic level information, the manual of the planes kind of information, extra prestige classes, and a few expanded magic items is more or less what made up the DMG. Alright, similarly to the DMG, the monster manual wasn't drastically altered in terms of what went into it with the revisions. There were a few minor changes, and there were certainly some pages added again to this to make it similar in size to the other two books. For the most part, though, the monsters did stay more or less the same, with one major exception, which I'll get into in a little bit. Some of the information that it did include that made it a little bit more useful was having things like having the abilities breakdown if you wanted to make one of the monsters into a player character, for example. And did that for several races or several monster types. So there's doppelgangers, did it for goblins, orcs, things of that nature. And another useful thing that they did add to some of the monsters, but not all, was a breakdown of their tactics. So if you look at the Mind Flare here, we've got our tactics. So in round 1, Mind Blast. Round 2, if most of the party is stunned, use Charm Monster on a remaining foe. If most of the party is not stunned, maintain distance and use Mind Blast again. Round 3, if fewer than 2 foes remain unstunned, order any charmed foes to protect you, grapple a stunned foe, blah blah. And one of my favorite things is if you have them as a boss, it gives another breakdown here. And round 4 is one of my favorites for the Mind Flare, where it's just simply eat brains. So that's kind of the one of the better changes that was made to the monster manual in 3.5. There was one major change that a lot of monsters were affected by in 3.5, and that was a change to the way damage reduction was handled. So in 3.0, certain monsters need to be attacked with magic weapons, usually of a specific enhancement bonus. And it tended to be for most monsters between +1 to +3 until you got up to epic levels. If 3.0 did have some enemies like the werewolf and the vampire, that their damage reduction could be negated by silver weapons, which was great as far as flavor goes. It definitely made sense. But the problem with it is that a magic weapon would supersede a silvered weapon. So by the time you would fight something like a werewolf or a vampire, you generally speaking had a magic weapon, or at least access to a spell that made a magic weapon for you. So it was a little bit disappointing as far as that went. When 3.5 came around, they mentioned that they wanted to make damage reduction based more off of some mythological sources. So with that in mind, you needed to now have, if it was damage reduction negated by silver weapon, you had to have a silver weapon. It wasn't negated by a magic weapon anymore. You actually had to have it with that property. So at first I thought it was a really great change, and they added the different materials that they had that the weapons had to be composed of were adamantine, silver, and cold iron, which is just, I guess, unforged iron. Which there were creatures in mythology that were vulnerable to iron, so it made sense. Then they added a few other ones like magic, so magic was now just simply a magic weapon. So whether it was +1 or +5, it still counted, and that's all that you needed. Then they had damage reduction for good or evil, and it would have been fine if it was used in moderation. One of the big problems is that damage reduction started to get different types would stack. So, for example, if you're fighting a vampire, you had to have a weapon that was both silver and magic. So it had to be both, not just one or the other. Some of them were one or the other, but a lot of them it had to be both types. And then if you have something like, for example, a Baylor, so where are we here? Okay, so their damage reduction is 15 and has to be cold, iron, and good. So let's just say you're in a situation where you're fighting a vampire and it has an ally that's a Baylor. For a fighter type, for example, they would have to have two different weapons. One that was cold iron and good aligned to fight the Baylor, and then they had to have one that was magic and silver to deal with the vampire to be as effective as they could be. And this situation came up more often than you would initially think, which meant that fighters, which tended to be the only ones really affected by this, because magical spells, their damage wasn't really affected by damage reduction unless the spell did just regular physical damage. So you have your spellcasters able to operate more or less at full efficiency, whereas your fighters, who should be your first line of defense, are now significantly reduced in their abilities just because of the amount of different things that you had to have for damage reduction. It really led to situations where fighters types would essentially have to carry usually two or three different types of weapons to deal with specific situations. So instead of being able to focus on simply carrying one weapon and enhancing that one weapon, you'd have fighters carrying around what was the equivalent of a golf bag full of different magical swords or arrows or bludgeoning and piercing and slashing and on top of everything else. So it just, unfortunately, it went a little bit too far. If it was something that was done only rarely for some of the toughest monsters, then that would have been fine. But damage reduction really got used a lot, and in most high-level encounters, it's something that's going to be coming up almost all the time. So it was a bit much as far as that went. In retrospect, they probably should have stuck with what they had, or have a system where maybe a certain magical plus of a weapon would be good enough to bypass damage reduction of a certain material or alignment or something like that. There could have been ways to work it out. But unfortunately, it just became a little bit overbearing. But anyway, that's basically all that I really wanted to talk about with the monster manual. So now we'll just kind of talk about some of the changes made to 3.5 in general. With the release of 3.5, Wizards had made a statement of how they wanted to release their books going forward. And what that meant wasn't so much they were talking about the rules information or things of that nature, but they wanted to talk about the actual format of the book itself. 3.0 had quite a few of these softcover books that were all black and white. And one of the things that Wizards had said when they were starting to revise D&D is that going forward, all of their books were going to be hardcover and full color. So they were going to get away from the cheaper production and stick with the hardcovers, which is something that I personally enjoyed. I like the fact that they had the hardcovers because they tend to hold up a little bit better on the shelf, hold up better to wear and tear. You don't have to worry about the covers as much as you do with the paperback books. Also with 3.5, they had a chance to go back and revisit some of their earlier material and revise more than just the 3 core books as well. So one of the things that they did, which was a huge improvement, was they improved the psionics system from 3.0 to 3.5. They call this the expanded psionics handbook, but really, they could get rid of that because this is the psionics handbook for 3.5, and they made a lot of great changes in this. In 3.0, psionics was horrible. You had to have multiple good ability scores in order to use your manifest your powers, and your powers didn't scale at all. So whenever you learned a power, if it was damage dealing, it would always deal that amount of damage. If it had a duration, it would always have that sort of duration. One of the things that they did with this book is they made it so that you only had to have one ability score, like any other spell casting type class, for your abilities. And you, instead of having your powers scale like spells did, you had the ability to augment some of them. So what that meant is if you spent extra power points, then for example you could have your powers have a greater effect. So it would increase damage, things of that nature. So it was a way of getting the most out of your abilities, even their lower level ones, which in 3.0 would just become completely and totally useless as you went on. So this was an absolutely great change. They also released a lot of really great supplements revolving around monster types, like the Draconomicon, for example. Lords of Madness was another great one. Fiendish Codex, Drow of the Underdark was another really good one. And they put out some books that became absolute essentials to any D&D player that was going to, go play from the time they were released going forward. And one of these books was the Spell Compendium, which took spells from other publications that had come out in the past. Some of them had never been updated for 3.5 that were finally done for this. Some were taken from Dragon Magazine, things of that nature. But this book became absolutely essential. It doesn't double any of the spells that were in the Player's Handbook, so you still need the Player's Handbook for a selection of spells that are in there. But this became one of the books that was a must-have on top of the core books. And another one that I'm just going to mention, I'm not going to go into all of them at this point because, again, it would just make the video way too long. But another absolutely essential book was the Player's Handbook 2. Which had new options for your pre-existing classes from the Player's Handbook, some new items for classes that were introduced in some of the class-oriented books like Complete Warrior, Complete Arcane, Complete Divine, stuff like that. They had some new options in this book, some new classes, and just an example of one of the changes that they made, the Druid had an alternate class feature where you got rid of Wild Shape. But in exchange, you got an ability that you took on an aspect of a particular animal type. So you would gain like a new type of attack and a bonus to like strength or con or stuff like that. So it worked more like Barbarian Rage, which is a lot easier to get your head around. Now, that being said, there were a lot of great books that were released, but there were also a lot of material in the books that just wasn't as high quality as maybe it could have been. And one of the big things is that early 3.5 focused heavily on prestige classes. Books like Complete Arcane, Complete Divine, Complete Warrior had half of their page count just filled with prestige classes. And they weren't really the greatest in my opinion. It was just way too many options. And a lot of times they just weren't as good as what you could get if you just would have stayed to the base class instead of, diverging off into the prestige class. So Unfortunately, a lot of their releases in the first couple of years was so heavily inundated with prestige classes that it just got to the point where I just basically said, no. If you want to have a prestige class, look at the DMG, but that's pretty much all I'm going to agree to. Now, they did fix that later on. Some of their later books had, instead of having 15 to 20 prestige classes, only had about 4 or 5, and each one had like a 4 or 5 page write-up on the history of the class, because most of them are now tied to organizations, giving a little bit of history of the organization and how it fit into the world. So they did fix that going forward, but there was a huge focus on that early on that just didn't really sit well for me. But aside from that, another one of the products that they did release along the same time as 3.5, and I believe it was in October of 2003, which is the Coast-released D&D Minis. So we'll talk about this a little bit. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, because I do plan on hopefully getting to recording a video specifically about D&D Minis in the future. But what D&D Miniatures was, is it was a game that was the successor to Chainmail. It used a lot of the basic structure of Chainmail, which, if you're not familiar, Chainmail was a miniatures game that had, it was pewter figures that you had to put together and paint yourself. And there were different factions that were all tied to a specific theme. So there was like the dwarves, they had their own separate faction. You had your elves, then you had like your savage humanoids, like your orcs, hobgoblins, bugbears. They were a particular faction. Then you had good humans, evil humans, and they all had like a flavor to them. So it was really well thought out game. You played it on open tabletop with measuring tapes to kind of determine how far away you were from things. So as far as that goes, Chainmail was a great game. However, it was replaced with D&D Miniatures, which was a cheaper to produce version of the game, which used, instead of the pewter figures, it now used plastic pre-painted miniatures. Now, in addition to that, instead of having factions with a theme, the factions were now based on alignment. So you'd have like lawful good, lawful evil, chaotic evil. And if it was, you had a type that was like, say, neutral good, then it could be in either lawful good or chaotic good and things of that nature. They also had different degrees of rarity. So there was commons, uncommons, and rares. Now, D&D Minis was actually highly successful when it first came out. I know at the local store that I would go to, the owner couldn't get any of these onto the shelf. It wasn't a matter of having difficulty keeping them on the shelf, he couldn't get them onto the shelf. Whenever an order would come in, the entire case had already been determined, like called for by different people, and he would have to limit how many boosters a person could pre-order or reserve in their name, just to ensure that as many people as possible ended up actually getting some miniatures. Now, D&D Minis, it was highly successful in the beginning. After every 3 or 4th set, they would kind of go back and reset and go back to a new starter set. So instead of having like a constant power creep, you get power creep, from one set to the next, and then they would kind of reset and go back to a set with lesser powerful creatures. So it was kind of their way of trying to get more life out of it. I loved the game at first. I spent a lot of money on the game initially. Sometimes some sets I sink $200 into, just trying to get specific rares. And unfortunately, where it was randomized, a lot of times I didn't get what I was hoping to. So like, for example, this Black Dragon is one of the few rares that I wanted to get that I actually ended up pulling. And there were some sets that I spent, like Archfiends, for example, was a set where the 2 minis that I really wanted to get was Dritz Duerden and the Aspect of Bane. And I spent at least 200 on booster packs for that set and didn't get either of them. So it was one of those things that eventually I got less and less interested, and there would be some sets where I would just buy maybe 1 or 2, and then I just kind of stopped buying them altogether. But it was a fun game, for what it was, and I did get, quite a few, a couple of years of enjoyment out of it, so it was definitely, worth the experience, if nothing else. Now that said, with D&D miniatures kind of going into a bit of a decline, D&D 3.5 also started to decline from about 2000 and late 2006 until it was ultimately discontinued in 2008. And a large part of why it started to kind of have that decline was there's a few different factors, but one of the big ones was the amount of books that they released. Um, Wizards of the Coast released a minimum of 2 books a month every month for the entirety of 3.5's run, at least until I stopped actively really following it, which was around the mid to late 2007. So 2 books a month, and there were a lot of times where they would end up releasing 3 books a month. So at least 4 times a year. There was a month where there were 4 books that all came out on the same day. And again, remember, these are all hardcover now. So the prices, at least where I lived in Canada, range from about $47 to $65 per book. So it got really expensive in a hurry. There were some books that they released that were of questionable use, things that made you kind of think that maybe they were starting to run out of ideas. And these were books like ones that I actually ended up passing up, pretty much all of them. One was, like Frostburn and Sandstorm, which were, books about this thick, dedicated solely to running adventures in like an ice setting, an Arctic setting, or a desert setting, which you can include a little bit of information in the DMG, and that's really all that you kind of need. So I stayed away from those. I stayed away from Unearthed Arcana, which was just a book of extra, optional rules that I really didn't want to ever get into because, I didn't enjoy any of them. At least the ones that I kind of knew about. And then there was things like towards the end they gave up on supplements altogether because they just didn't have anything else they could really put out. So instead they would release a lot of adventures, which I didn't really bother with because at the time I was collecting Dungeon Magazine, and Dungeon Magazine had complete campaigns from levels 1 through 20 that they were running. So I had no shortage of adventures, so I kind of gave up on purchasing any of those. And a couple of the last supplements that they put out were books called Exemplars of Evil and Elder Evils. Exemplars of Evil was a book dedicated to designing NPCs and villains, which, when it came out, which I think was in 2007, anybody that's been an active D&D player or DM has already designed so many villains and NPCs that they didn't really need a book to help them at that point. That's one of the things that probably could have been released within the first, few months to a year, and it would have been a fantastic book. But unfortunately, it just wasn't as useful for seasoned players at the time that it came out. And Elder Evils was just high-level monsters, basically, to fight. So those are ones that I completely missed. The sad thing is that 3.5 was still popular amongst consumers long after they discontinued it, like long after they moved to the next edition. People still wanted to play 3.5. They weren't, ready to move on to a whole new system yet. They were comfortable with 3.5, they enjoyed it, and a lot of the kind of issues that people may start to develop with it weren't super obvious or that annoying at that point in time. So I'll touch on that a little bit. But Wizards of the Coast, if they would have limited themselves to 1 book a month, with maybe once or twice a year having a second book come out in the same month, they could have easily gotten from 2003 until 2010, 11, 12, before there was really a desire to kind of move on type of thing. Like I myself ran 3.5 from the time that it came out until it was about 2012. So I ran it for 4 years after they discontinued it, and they only ran it for 5 years before they stopped. So I almost got twice the amount of life out of this edition than Wizards of the Coast did, and that's something that probably could have been changed by limiting the amount that they produced and the amount of titles that they put out. Another issue that started to come up around this time was the economy. Especially in the U.S., was starting to go into a bit of a decline around this time. So having 2, 3 books come out all in the same month, again made things difficult for the average consumer. So they were selling less, maybe not because people were less interested in buying, but because they just didn't have the expendable income to purchase multiple books a month. So, if they would have throttled back a bit, then perhaps they could have gotten more lifespan out of it just from that perspective alone. Now, they were also starting to face competition from online role-playing games like World of Warcraft, for example, which was starting to kind of slowly chip away from the consumer base. I'm not really going to talk a lot about World of Warcraft and its impact on tabletop role-playing in this video. It did start around the time the 3.5 was out, but it had more of an impact on the next edition that Wizards of the Coast released. So I'm going to talk more about that at that point in time. Now, another side effect of the economy starting to go into decline saw the ending of one of the longtime staples of Dungeons & Dragons, which was their monthly magazines. So Dragon Magazine and Dungeon Magazine were officially discontinued, final issue in September of 2007. So something that had been a part of D&D basically from the very beginning was suddenly no longer something that Wizards of the Coast found to be financially viable, so they had to discontinue it. So that was definitely a huge blow. Now, Dragon Magazine, I wasn't always the biggest fan of. I found that a lot of months were hit or miss, but Paizo Publishing did something absolutely fantastic with Dungeon. It made it a magazine that I legitimately look forward to each and every month. So it was a shame to see this become a victim of the economy and the decline of sales for D&D. So basically what had happened, Wizards of the Coast worked themselves into a corner, they burned themselves out, and they ran the well dry. A lot of gamers, like I said, just weren't ready to give up 3.5 by the time that Wizards announced that they were going to be releasing the next edition of D&D come 2008. So in 2007 they announced that they were going to begin developing it, which is going to be known as D&D 4th edition. The announcement didn't really sit well with people because, again, they just weren't ready for it yet. But Wizards didn't really have much of an alternative because they couldn't go back and do another updated version of the core books. They couldn't simply release like D&D 3.75. They had to put something else out new because they just simply didn't really have anything left to put out for 3.5. Anyway, that's pretty much it for D&D 3.5. I hope you enjoyed it. It's not quite the same as all the previous editions in terms of like the history of what was going on, because really up until the last couple of years of 3.5, the industry was actually pretty stable. D&D was no longer suffering from the social stigma from religious groups or parental groups. It would become more socially acceptable, and gaming had really worked its way into popular culture. So as far as what was going on around the time, wasn't really a whole lot going on with 3.5 itself. It was kind of a transitional thing where everything was kind of smooth running, more or less, until the next edition. So I hope that you do join me for my next video where I talk about D&D 4th edition.